Welcome to ProCaleo. Today we're going to look at some running for a patient with hip pain, foot pain, and back pain. Not all at the same time. Just comes and goes, and she has a huge routine pre-run and post-run that she has to do in order to run. She doesn't feel successful running, she doesn't really enjoy running, and she can't go as far as she'd like to, but as a mom, it keeps her sane. And she's learned to just accept that this is all that she can do. And I believe that at her age, she should be able to do whatever she wants to do and not have a huge routine in order to do that. Just getting hip strength or foot strength or stretching out your calves or stretching out your hip flexors won't affect change in your running. That's the biggest key takeaway from this. Let's roll the footage so you can see it all together. If you see anything, why don't you comment below, see if you're right. We'll walk through it all together and we'll give you some action steps to help any of you who struggle with any of the same impairments. If you have any questions on gait terms, reference this video right up here to fully see from swing to loading response to terminal extension, all those different terms that we use, learn that through here. Let's look through this together. First, let's get rid of the letterbox so you can see the full footage. So she has actually pretty good swing, and she has actually pretty good initial loading response where her foot is landing underneath her trunk. She is a pretty upright runner, but her foot is landing underneath her trunk, which is good, which means the hips are working when they should be. The biggest thing that happens as we track that leg going from swing through stance is that when that heel goes behind her, she doesn't hit full hip extension. She hardly really even hits hip extension. You can see how that knee is still slightly bent, which means you're staying in knee flexion because the anterior part of the hip is tight. Now, you could state that she needs to stretch out her hip flexors, her quads and her hip flexors specifically, but she's done that before. And that's been the advice from many other doctors before. So why isn't it persisting into her run? Why isn't that hip mobility that she does have, I tested, she's pretty good. It could obviously be improved, but it's better than what's presenting in her running. So why isn't it there? Body's smart. You gotta teach the body to use the new hip mobility. So that's the takeaway here. She doesn't have full triple extension. You should see a very straight line from her hip to her heel. Later down in the video, you'll see it, but this is a nice way to track that knee flexion angle, and you can see how it doesn't get fully straight. So again, her initial contact is pretty good. Her mid stance is pretty good, but the terminal stance needs some help. That knee needs to get into full terminal extension to get a full stance to improve hip activation from mid stance to terminal stance. So here is one of two examples that shows how much her body moves up and down. It's what we call vaulting. And you can look through the specifics of it in the part 2 of vaulting and how she compensates with the right foot and that to compensate for that left hip flexor, which is when she gets the most vertical translation. Explaining it as simple as possible. If you want to be running in this direction, do not waste any energy going up. I want to go forward, I shouldn't be wasting energy up. If you look at really good runners, here's an example, you can see that they are staying super flat and there isn't any translation up and down. The more up and down you go, the more impact you're putting into your joints. I want you to be gliding or sliding like a gazelle or like you're ice skating, moonwalking over the ground. That shows that you're getting the nice cyclical running. For her, she's very segmented. She's honestly looks better slow motion, but when we speed it up, you can see that she's nice and bouncy, which isn't nice. So we see a little vaulting, which means that calves are working too hard and glute is not working as well, and it's a compensation for the opposite side hip flexor. So in order to clear that foot, she's having to bump up because she doesn't get enough hip flexion on that left side. What do you know? She had a pretty severe injury to the left femur. That injury was 15 years ago? Right, Sarah? Right, 15? 20, 18 years ago. That left femur injury is that left femur injury was 18 years ago. So it shows that your body has a great memory. Pain creates the strongest memory, and our body's learned how to compensate for that memory because she didn't get great rehab after her injury. So now we're looking anteriorly, and you can see it feels like it's following those quads moving, but if you look specifically at the pant line, you can see that when that left hip, so the hip on your right, the left hip goes into hip flexion, you can see how much your pelvis is contorting upwards. Again, another example of how that left hip does not properly go into hip flexion. So you can see again when the right foot comes up, so on your left side, her right femur, that pelvis stays pretty level. That femur goes into hip flexion and out of hip flexion nicely. And then we look to the left femur, and that left hip goes into hip flexion, her pelvis contorts upward, and that's where that low back pain is being a part of. It's getting initiated because she's compressing that left lumbar spine for compensating for poor left hip flexion. So this is still building the story that it's not so much a mobility deficit of her hip flexors. So their hip flexors are tight, but they're not mechanically tight. They are more neurologically tight, meaning they don't know how to properly get used, and the timing or the sequencing of them is off. So we say that's a strength activation coordination. So she needs to learn how to better engage her hip flexors with a very nice stable lumbar spine. I'll explain this all at the end. Stay for the end for the quick synopsis. So here's what probably most of you guys saw. The Trendelenburg gait. When her left foot contacts the ground, the right hip falls down. So the only thing holding her up is her left femur. That left glute is not doing its job, so the hips fall down. That's when you get that uneven downward slope of the pelvis. Most people know about this because it's probably the first thing any PT, chiropractor, massage therapist, trainer talked about. It's very, very common in the world, and it's also very common to be diagnosed, functionally diagnosed. The key is we need to learn how to treat it better. If you've had this before, you've probably done clamshells, bridges, monster walks, crab walks, side-to-side walks, whatever you want to call them, but it probably did not translate to single leg hip coordination. That's how this is true for Sarah as well. Sarah's done all these things, but you can see in her running, that left hip still doesn't work when it's on single limb stance. So that low back is getting compressed, that femur is getting compressed, that knee's falling inwards, and then we'll look at the feet, but you can see how her feet, both feet are pretty overpronated, which is a compensation for the hips, which you'll see when we look at crossover sign. Specifically here, you can see Trendelenburg. When that left foot is on the ground, that right hip falls down, which means that left gluteus medius is not doing its job. So here's another example of triple extension. So that line is where her hip, knee, and heel should be crossing through. So she needs to get all three of those points through that white line. You can see that that knee is still slightly bent, meaning she's not getting full hip extension and terminal knee extension, which means the coiling, the kinetic energy, the power that she could create from her hips is not there. And again, we talked about how those hip flexors could be at fault. Most likely it's a coordination between her glutes, her hip flexors, and her abdominals. So this is building a bigger and bigger story. The more we see, the more centrally we have to go. So I'll sum it up in the end, but Sarah needs pillar stability. She needs to learn how to stabilize that pelvis in hip flexion and hip extension. So these are less stretching exercises and more activation, coordination, synergy, brain training, becoming aware of what her hips actually are. Because in her exam, she realized that she doesn't know a lot of how to control the pelvis in hip extension or hip flexion. So that's the goal. So that's the synopsis at the end, but that's the pre-synopsis for you. Here's the better example of the vaulting. Specifically see when she goes off of her right foot, how she goes higher than when she goes off her left foot. So that's alluding to the power she's creating with her right foot is compensating for the swing on the left side. So everything in running, walking, etc., everything in life is reciprocal. So if there's a vaulting issue coming off the right foot, that means it's her body's compensating for something going on in the swing phase of the left foot. So that left heel, left toes need to clear the ground, and if she didn't vault on the right foot, her toes would probably clip. This is meaning she's not getting enough hip flexion on the left side to clear her foot, so her body learned to vault off the right foot. Again, this plays into the femur fracture from a car accident she had, I think it was 18 years ago. All right, the dreaded crossover sign. The most inaccurate test unless you're on a treadmill and a fixed camera. So the errors for this is if you move side to side, or as a film, the cameraman moves side to side, or if the camera itself moves side to side. It's not going to be the most accurate, but I tried to track it in my software. Anytime that left foot, or anytime either foot crosses over that line, that's called crossover sign. That's a compensation for glutes not working. So you can see specifically that left foot crosses over the line more consistently as the camera moves side to side. My apologies. But anytime that left foot crosses over the line, it means you're going into adduction to compensate for the same side glute not working. So left crossover sign means left gluteus medius, gluteus maximus aren't doing their job, so your body learned to compensate for that. This is a relative knee valgus, but it's relative because your knee actually isn't moving inwards, it's your whole body's moving inwards, which puts your hip into this femoral internal rotation adduction position. So this means that the glute isn't working as well, which it comes back to that again. I use this clip quite a bit, but look at this lady's pelvis from the back. Notice how you can't even really tell that her hips are moving. Her pelvis is moving. Her hips are just moving nice and back and forth, and the pelvis is a nice stable surface. She's not going up and down, and the hips aren't wiggling back and forth. That's what we're looking for when it comes to this type of impairments that nearly everyone has in running, and it always can be traced back to this when you have any lower quarter injury when it comes to running specifically. So what does all this mean? A lot of stuff to work on, so it can get confusing, complicated, discouraging. Let's keep it simple for you. Glutes need to work better, pelvis needs to stay stable. It's as simple as that. My job is to then take her through exercises, awareness exercises, specifically, not like get stronger, do these things. It's like learn what your body's like. Learn how your pelvis moves in anterior and posterior planes. It doesn't need to do just posterior tilts. It doesn't need to do just anterior tilts. Hip flexors do need to be stretched, but hip flexors more importantly need to be engaged properly. They actually need to get stronger. Tightness equals weakness. You remember that, Sarah? So we need to learn how to control our pelvis better, learn how to get that reciprocal gait back. That's the first importance. In exercise, watch this video for the progressions of exercises, but she needs to start supine first just to learn pelvic stability, abdominals specifically, and then we'll go to standing or half kneeling specifically, then standing, then single leg, double leg, everything, that progression. Watch that video for the progressions. We need to get her to single limb hip stability, pelvic stability before her running is going to be comfortable. Does that mean she shouldn't be running? Absolutely not. She should totally be running. She should just keep doing her routine that she tens unit, icing, foam rolling, stretching, all these things that she's been doing for years just to be able to run. But our goal is to make that not be her reality. She should be able to do a quick hip activation exercise and then go on a run. She should be able to run a half marathon, a full marathon, things that she once gave up because she was told that those aren't her reality, that she's getting older. But reality is that she just needs to re-engage with her body, learn more about her pelvis, learn how to actually use her glutes, and then learn how to integrate that into running. It's pretty simple, and it's fun stuff. We need to learn marching, skipping, exploding, decelerating, jumping, landing, bounding, all this fun stuff once we get you more aware of your pelvic stability. If you have any questions on any of this, let me know, but be on the lookout for more videos that describe these terms more and more so it makes more and more sense for you. Until next time, welcome to Pro Kaleo.